Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beyond Binary Thinking, a podcast where we try to inform ourselves while remaining open to differing opinions and changing our own perspectives. From Amsterdam, I'm Marijn.
From Plymouth, I'm Chris.
Also from Plymouth, I'm also Chris, but I guess Christian.
From Dublin, I'm M.
Very exciting. Thank you so much for joining us today, guys. We've got a couple of special guests here because they've spent some time in China. It's a big topic, which we've been touching on in other episodes, but would really like to do a deep dive on. So to open things up, it'd be really interesting to hear about your time in China and your experience, and maybe just quickly kick us off with something you think people often get wrong about China.
Okay, I guess let me start. So I spent most of my time in China in close to Beijing, like a tiny town that was just being developed in like the outskirts of Beijing. And my main thing was I was teaching English there to like up to 15-year-old kids. And it was this really old Confucian school that just decided to have white people there so that they get no money, basically. So they're going all business savvy to make sure that they look fancier than they actually are. They did succeed. They had lots of really rich kids.
Yeah, I know that racket, just like having a white person quota and having them on all the billboards.
Oh, yeah. We had like all the official meetings everywhere. It's like, hey, we have white guys. It's cool. We're competent. And yeah, then the last 3 months of my year in China, I was in Shenzhen, so all the way in the south. And I was there working at this really fancy kindergarten where like all the families that had like one kid and way too much money just dropped the kid off for the day. And so I got to see lots of Chinese middle-class people, which was quite interesting, I suppose. And I guess my overall impression of China is they are incredibly similar to people in Europe. I feel like if you changed out the language and switch some words, let's say for old people, like you switch Christianity to some Confucian philosophy, you end up with very, very similar ideas. But maybe something to talk about.
That's interesting, sure. And how about you, Em? What was your time in China like, and what do you think people get wrong about the Chinese?
Well, I had a great time in China. I was out there studying at a university as part of my degree. I was out there doing intermediate Chinese, and I was in a city called Nanjing. So Christian was saying he was up in Beijing. That means north capital. Nanjing is south capital. So once upon a time, it was the capital of one of the dynasties. So it was a huge city, and it was, a really interesting place to be at the time. My interpretation, like I was studying there and I was also working, which I shouldn't have been, but I was teaching lots of different schools, similar to what you were doing, Christian, different age groups and the burgeoning middle class of that city. But I suppose I find there's a real difference between, China proper and Chinese people, the Communist Party that are ruling things there, and the people that you meet every day on the street. And there's a big disconnect there in the way we interpret China. So that's something I'd like to get into a little bit more in the podcast.
I mean, my impression is that the average Chinese person's quite politically disengaged, because what's the point in having an opinion? Like,
I mean,
not going to
I think
vote.
the main thing people can get wrong very easily is that China is a giant country with just a crazy amount of different people. And just like saying that, I think the average Chinese person is this and that. It's very similar saying like, oh, the average American is a Texan, like a redneck, basically. Doesn't really help you. I think the really big difference, at least from what I can tell, is that there's this really big generational difference. That nowadays people over 40, they are much more, let's say, apolitical, I think, in terms of they want to work in like a middle class city. They want to just make money, basically, and just have a secure house. And then I felt for the younger people, so like when I was there, people around like 18 to 20, they were much more interested in politics. And it might have been just my own bias because I talked to them more. But I felt like they not freely talked about politics because they know they could get into trouble. And they also had a lot less information. But generally, every young person that I met, they could access Facebook, they could access YouTube. They were interested in reading some Western news, at least a little bit. And they were interested in the world.
Were you talking in Chinese with them or predominantly English?
A bit of Chinese, but yeah, mostly in English.
Yeah. So
Is
I
that,
mean,
is that
So, I mean, yeah, it's
selection
my own
bias
bias.
already?
yeah.
Yeah.
You'll have an interesting group
Yeah.
there that's probably middle class, often educated outside, or at least had.
Oh yeah, I talked like the educated middle class, obviously.
But in terms of the what you say, average American or average Chinese, I think it's interesting that I think it's hard for Westerners because it's not a polled country. We're not polling them like we're polling the United States. Like we can see with election cycles kind of where things are leaning, right? We can see Bernie Sanders coming up. Oh, there's a progressive youth movement in America. We can see that happening within numbers. I think from China, I don't know if there are numbers like that. But I've never heard about them in the newspapers.
I think the closest you ever had to that was in the late 80s when there was the student movement, and the way that turned out in the end, it's kind of quashed that sort of aspiration, And I think I agree with Christian there about the generational divide. You would find older people to be more opinionated, and you had the sort of the middle age group who were intent on just, getting the house, getting the mortgage, getting, sorted in life. But with the younger group, there's a creeping nationalism coming through, and that's all, part of Xi Jinping's engineering of, the resurgent China. So I think that has a big part to play there as well in terms of people having more opinions.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like my general impression of China was that it's basically the West circa 50, 60 years ago. So if you looked in the West 50, 60 years ago, the example I noticed a lot was when I was at the school, they had a stray cat that just had some babies. And I guess the janitor or like the maintenance guy, he basically took all the cats into a big bag and just smashed them on the ground until they all died. And I was like, okay, that's absolutely horrible. And all the kids were like, yeah, this is fine, normal life. And I taught this to my mom. My mom was like, oh yeah, my uncle did the same like 40 years ago, no difference. And I found this really instructional. It was like, yeah, like the whole animal rights thing in the West, it's also really recent. Like only last 20 years, there has been anything for vegetarians in the first place or any kind of meaningful animal rights thing. And if you can see the same with nationalism, that let's say 40, 50 years ago, or let's say even more, 60 years ago, we just finished the Second World War, and there was a lot more that, especially in Europe, different nations considered themselves completely different. And I think there was still a time when like Irish people and Italians were considered like not whites. And yeah, that's all nationalism.
But something like a pet is a privilege, right? It's something that you can afford to have, take it to the vet, feed it. And, when you've lived through something like a famine where up to 60 million people starved to death in living memory, you're not going to look at something and say, oh, well, that thing has, you prioritize other things. So I think this whole concept of pets is a very novel thing in China. And I did see it, like people were putting special shoes on their dogs and nice.
Right, but that's an upper class thing, right? Like that's
absolutely.
That really is.
I think it's kind of difficult to impose these. Like if I went into a wet market, I didn't like what I saw. But in the eyes of most people in China, in that city I was living in, a turtle was there to be eaten. Don't worry about the rights of the turtle or how it's living or its final days. So,
but be realistic. We don't care about the rights of the animal here in the West. We like to be very.
It's true.
I mean, a little bit.
We're cognitive dissonant.
We do, unless it's yummy, and then it's fucked.
I know.
The speed of the slaughter cycle has only increased within the last 10 years, even in the West. Let's
I know, but there's at least.
We love to condemn the Chinese for eating dogs because we drew the line there, which is an imaginary line.
Sure.
It's an imaginary cutie line.
But look at the mink fur farms in Denmark the last few weeks. I mean, who are we to turn around now and say that one festival that happens down the south of China every year where they eat dogs, it's marginal compared to what we're doing.
And you can literally track the change, right? So I think eating dogs in Korea has finally completely gone out of fashion, and they've killed their festival for it. And you can tie that to economic growth. And as you say, it's a luxury you can afford to be like, oh, this is pets, not food. Like,
sure.
All right. Fair enough.
Weird tangent that we went off there, but
No, it's an interesting one though, because it often is used to sort of dehumanize the Chinese, and we're blind to our own. This is why I find it so interesting.
Absolutely.
Having
Like
come back from Asia, people, talk about Thailand as corrupt and it's bad democracy and all these things. And you're like, okay, but the Conservatives have won every election for the last how long? And how long are they going to win elections for? And how many government deals do they give to their friends? I'm like, it's sort of like more subtle here. And it's easier to see it in another country and easy to smirk at it, right?
Sure. And like what I always come back to is there's a phrase in Chinese, "Wo Ursula," I'm so hungry, I'm starving. And people would say that very nonchalantly, but I was told never say that around people who are over 50 or 60, because they lived through the famine. So to them, a dog is a dog. So yeah.
So the perception I've had with China is that especially in Southeast Asia, for years, America's been courting this foreign trade and saying, look, democracy is the way, free trade is the way, don't look at China, they're doing it all wrong. And in the last decade, like that message just has less and less sway. And like the rest of the world is looking towards American politics and being like, that's kind of messy, not necessarily that effective. And China's going from strength to strength, not having to deal with messy democracy.
China just signed a massive free trade deal.
Today, yeah.
Yeah, it was today or yesterday.
The
Yeah,
Regional
I think it was actually
Comprehensive Economic Partnership?
RECP or something like that.
RCEP, yeah.
Yeah, that way. Yeah, and basically China signed with most East Asian countries, bar India, a pretty substantial free trade agreement. Obviously excluding the US, but it took a really long time to negotiate.
I think Australia is in it as well, so it's
New Zealand and Japan as well. It's actually quite big.
Yeah, so this is interesting. If you look at one of Obama's main things he was trying to do was set up trade deals with all of the countries around China. And it was sort of like part of the narrative of Trump is that, oh, this deal would be bad for American jobs. And it sort of killed it. The Trans-Pacific something.
I mean, the thing is, oh yeah, sorry, you had M.
Oh yeah, sorry, that was the TPP. That was a big deal at the time. It was supposed to contain China a little bit, but sure, when Trump pulled out of it, then that steered the way for a rival deal, which was signed today or yesterday. So
yeah, China just stepped into the vacuum, right?
Yeah, like what's been happening now for the last few years, really.
So I mean, I think we can conclude, right, that China is making all the right moves in terms of geopolitics, right? They invested heavily in Africa. They've set up the Silk Road 2.0. They outright almost own countries in South America. They signed trade deals left and right. They're on their way to become the next global power, right? Especially with the fall of the American civilization. So is that's
a strong
thing?
Statement?
You don't think so? You disagree?
It's hard to tell. Maybe.
I think both of those points are worth discussing. So first, is China on the up and up? And I had an interesting chat with them about this. So the big question really is is everything China's doing sensible? From the outside, it seems to be amazing, right? Like buying up debt, buying airports, building all this infrastructure. The old joke is that, America's paid a lot of money to break the Middle East and then China's been paid to rebuild it. So is it all that rosy and good? Or are some of these just sort of like vanity propaganda?
I mean, I would say generally China is definitely they're growing at still 5 or 6%. This year, obviously a bit difficult, but they're still massively growing. And well, they are expanding globally. The one, or let's say the couple of major problems they have economically is debt growing up or debt just expanding massively. That what we in the West now think about as debt, we usually talk about public debt, so what the government owes. But the bigger problem in China is private debt, that most Chinese companies just expand as much as they can and just borrow as much money as they can to facilitate that process. And as a consequence, I think there's about 3 times as much debt as the combined values of Chinese, all of Chinese business. Obviously, as long as they're making profits, that's not a problem. They can repay it. But once there is a major global recession or a major problem in general, then it would be interesting to see where all of this is going.
Right.
But yeah, generally, unless something like, say, a pretty major global problem occurs, like let's say the US collapsing, yeah, I think China would expand quite just consistently.
I mean, and this is even the case for Silicon Valley, right? There's a lot more money invested than there is money returned. It's built on a promise.
It's the nature of finance, right? You reach into the future, borrow as much as you can based on the bullshit hockey stick
recession will kill that too.
projection.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I mean, that's basically Amazon, but like Amazon was not profitable for a really long time because they just reinvested the entire money and either undercut the competition or just bought them or just invested into infrastructure. And only 2 years ago, they started to make profits. But then there was an actual hockey stick. So it goes up, and Jeff Bezos now, I think he makes like $50 billion a quarter or something. Some insane amount of money.
That was quite insane. Yeah.
but that's how they can borrow so much, because the whole Silicon Valley model is, do you know where the real money is? Being a monopoly, and government's too slow to react to break it up like they do in other industries. So let's just borrow till we can crush everyone, and then how much more profit can you make when you're a complete monopoly? So that the whole model is built around that. I think famously 6 years ago, Salesforce, which is like a customer relationship management software used by business, they made a profit for the first quarter ever. And the CEO sent a letter to shareholders apologizing. They said, we just couldn't spend the money quick enough, sorry.
Sure. And, you know, you see things like the Belt and Road Initiative or One Belt, One Road, and you think about the motivations behind that. And for me, like the obvious motivation is that, you know, just they need more infrastructure projects. Every airport has been built, every highway has been built, every subway system, there's nothing left. And, you know, there's so many state-owned enterprises in China that rely on infrastructure projects. So what a great opportunity to start building highways in, you know, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan. And it's great because, you know, our kind of Western morals would say, oh, we're not going to lend you money because we don't agree with your politics. Well, China has filled that vacuum. They're non-interventionist policies, you know.
Yeah, none of the strings attached, right? Like just.
Well, maybe not
I mean,
politically.
the West does do that. I mean, they give a crazy amount of money to, let's say, for example, Israel.
Sure.
And
That's
we
quite
are
specific.
all aware of like all the problems there.
That's
No,
quite specific, you know.
No, when you look at foreign aid, Israel is the main recipient of foreign aid in the world. They get the most amount of money, which is kind
Sure.
of weird because they're not a poor country by any stretch of like any measurement.
Sure, but there's a lot related to that, right? There's first of all the Holocaust related to that, and second of all the fact that
That's different payments.
they're within the Arabic world. Well, is that really all different than what America politics wise is supporting Israel?
I mean, it's their strategic ally in the region.
Yeah,
like
and,
the main
and I presume with most
Well,
of these
I think
infrastructure and
also-
economical investments, right? Like there's
Yeah,
there's
I
a
mean, it's the same
military
with,
tag on, right? Like
It's the same that Saudi Arabia gets a huge amount of US aid, or like not US aid, but at least money from the US. They don't care if there's like a dictator that kills anybody that disagrees with him, basically. They still get money.
does China build military bases in other people's countries as part of this deal then?
I know they're building them on the Diaoyu Islands or Senkaku Islands, but I personally haven't heard of military bases in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think for now they just bought some, or they leased some bits of land and built like trading ports. And now the last couple of years, I think they started to have like a bit of military there, but it's very, very little. So there's nothing like the US where you have like an actual military base all across the world. That's not a thing yet.
So, and even if they would say if they would do what the US does, right, put military bases around the world, but at the same time they improve infrastructure, they invest in all kinds of other stuff for local economies, and do the kind of world leader thing that America tried to do but didn't really succeed at doing. Again, is it a bad thing? Is what I'm trying to. Right? I do think maybe it is, because we're seeing also things like the social credit system that it's like, yeah, you can play along, but only according to our rules.
No, it's just, it
Sorry.
is an interesting question. And that's what everyone's trying to figure out when it comes to these big strategic plans. But I will say, like, China is one of the only countries in the world that has adopted soft power as actual government policy. And they've been putting so much money and research into soft power. So when you look at something like the Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, if they manage to do a quarter, or even if they manage to do 10% of what's envisioned in that plan, they will have made an improvement in it somewhere. So I suppose that's what they're setting out to do. But it all depends on how much public good comes out of it. Like, there are certain islands around, places around Cambodia, where they're building these casinos and they're destroying the vistas there, and there's pollution problems and all sorts of issues. Like, is that public good? Are Cambodians going to thank them for that?
Well, it's the old classic though, that you can't go from a third world to a developed country without cracking a few coral reefs along the way, right?
But I think the counterexample, so when we think nowadays of South Korea, we think of a democratic country that is basically a Western country, except with Asian people, let's put it that way. But South Korea, until fairly recently, was, well, a military dictatorship. After the Second World War, the US gave them quite a bit of money to rebuild. And that had nothing to do with democracy or supporting just any kind of, let's say, democratic thinking or anything. They just want to have a regional ally to, well, against North Korea and China.
Yeah, just to surround China, just like most of the bases in the Middle East is just to surround Russia.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. It just happened that for South Korea over a long, they basically did what China did up to a point where they got richer and richer. And at some point you had trade union movements and workers' movements demanding more and more democratic rights. And this, over a fairly long period of time, pushed South Korea towards being a more democratic, or an actual democratic nation. I mean, this wasn't a given. This is something you might see in China today, where the government is strong enough because it's such a large country that they can ignore the pro-democracy movements. It's very hard to tell, but I think at least in terms of that China is investing into African and Central Asian countries, if they get richer, I think there's at least some hope to think that they would tend to become more democratic because they are so small and there's less of a distance between the workers and the people in charge. Although it's not a given, these things might happen, might not happen.
So the interesting thing is that, as far as I can tell, although American aid comes with very clear terms and conditions about governments, they preach protectionism, even if they don't necessarily apply those principles to their own markets. So far, I haven't seen China insisting on African countries become communist, right? Like, it doesn't seem to, those aren't the strings attached. The worry is you're giving large sums of money to, in many cases, military dictators, as we've said, with varying morals. I know both sides do that. But it's often on the understanding that interest won't have to be paid for 20 years, which is the perfect amount to prop up a dictator. And then I guess it's never going to be his problem to pay off the debt, right? That'll be the next guy's issue.
Yeah, but also it's whether these infrastructure projects are even necessary. A lot of the time that they aren't. The Chinese are petitioning governments saying, look, you could really do with this high-speed railway line here that nobody will be able to afford to use anyway, And most of the time it's for their own benefit, because they want to be able to transport goods quicker, geographically. I mean, a lot of that, you see there's a high-speed railway line that's going to go through Thailand, through Laos, all the way up. I mean, that's also for China's benefit, just to move goods quicker.
Very much like the British always say that India was good because we gave them trains, right? Like, you're welcome. But if you look at what the trains were mostly used for, it was to transport wealth out of India.
Exactly.
To Britain.
Exactly. And China they have limited resources, that's why they're going after Africa.
Hassan, is this any worse than British colonialism, American imperialism?
No, and I think the Chinese are colonizing in a different way. I mean, in my opinion, they colonized Xinjiang from the 1950s onwards. where, you know, Mao started putting Han Chinese people in Xinjiang. It's the Western region where the Uyghurs live. So, you know, they recognized that, oh, that area could be a problem in future. So let's start putting our own people there. The first 2 groups he sent starved because they didn't know how to live in the mountains. But now, you know, so many years later, it's nearly 50% demographic there. So if the Uyghurs do start up again looking for independence, well, they'll be able to say, but what about the Han Chinese who've been living here for so long? They're Xinjiang people too. So, I mean, it's nothing new, but I mean, in my opinion, it is colonialism.
Yeah, the same thing happened to Taiwan. When you look at pictures of it from like 100 years ago, it looks very similar to Hawaii, for example. But then because the Han Chinese just sent more and more of their people there, it became more and more Han Chinesey over a long period of time. And now it's basically just purely that, I think, or at least predominantly.
Yeah, same thing's happening with Nepal. So China figured out after Tibet that it wouldn't get away with another grab, but it wanted Nepal. It's already worked out that it's lost the war for oil. It's going for the war for water, which is going to become a lot more important. And so if it just captures all of the Himalayas, taking one country every 10 years, it'll be fine. And if you look at every person that had a second child who was Han Chinese, they just said, look, if you want to keep your rights, we'll send you to Nepal, go register for citizenship there, have as many babies as you want, we'll give you some money. And then you're about to get to a point where Nepal is going to democratically elect, we'll have the Chinese government to lead us, please. That'd be brilliant, thanks.
Exactly.
I mean, not defending China, but there's a very noticeable difference compared to colonialism. I mean, this is what I started talking about earlier, right at the beginning, before we recorded, I think. If you compare China to the US from the USSR, so Soviet Russia from 100 years ago, what we basically saw until the First World War was that Western Europe plus North America, they basically went around the world conquering everybody and just murdering everybody who disagreed. Conquered most of India, lots of Africa, but even the US, they went, for example, to the Philippines. They just attacked Mexico and stole taxes effectively. So lots of imperialism. And obviously this didn't go down very well in the developing world, but there's not much they could do to counter it, because if they had any kind of uprising, there would immediately be some kind of Western, much better equipped force, just killing them all effectively. But then all of a sudden, with the Russian Revolution, there was the largest country by landmass in the world becoming an actual counter movement. And they started to fund a crazy amount of independence movements all across the world. So now all of a sudden, the West did have to make at least some kind of offer that there was some interest in being part of the empire, effectively. And this is when you see, for example, Woodrow Wilson. He started the League of Nations, I think it was called, where countries have the right for self-determination. And this was a reaction to the Soviet Union, because now they had to have at least some kind of soft power that countries at least somewhat supported them, or at least support them more than they would support the Soviet Union. And yeah, this became really influential all across the world. That even, yeah, for example, China, the major reason why China didn't crumble after doing the Second World War, when Japan invaded them, was because Russia gave them a crazy amount of military aid and intelligence and general support. And without that, they might have just fallen apart. And yeah, so nowadays, to bring this back, the major advantage of China nowadays is that at least they are providing something beneficial to the third world. That if you are, I mean, if they make negotiations with the US, there's like, oh yeah, if we get foreign aid, we have to agree to the Washington Consensus. So we have to minimize our state. We can't do this thing. We can't do that thing. We can't do these and these things. China's like, yeah, here's some money, enjoy. We don't really care as long as you pay it back in, I don't know, half a century.
Well, that's almost the point. Yeah, that's almost the point I wanted to go. Is it not maybe better than any kind of imperialism and colonialism we've had before? Because let's be honest, like America World Police has not really been the greatest period for human history either, for many cultures around the world.
So it looks like it falls to me to disagree with everyone and play the devil's advocate again. I am entirely sympathetic with the excesses and moral evils of the British Empire. I'm not here to apologize for that. I do feel there's a genuine danger for someone that's it feels like whataboutism to me. And you look at that and go, yeah, well, the British Empire's bad. And also, yeah, look at how much America pollutes and all these things. You can be like, oh, look, there's another country doing bad. I don't want, when China is doing something on public record as being demonstrably evil, I don't think the appropriate response is, but 100 years ago, we were evil too. It's like, right. And most people now agree that Britain shouldn't go and try and reconquer Africa and make it an empire. So if that's the new moral standard, I think we should be saying to China, hey, China, don't do that. And if that's hypocrisy, then I think...
But make it specific then.
Well, okay, but if that's hypocrisy, then we say to our own politicians, also, we shouldn't be doing that. And let's do a UN consensus that we all agree not to do that thing, which is now the new moral standard. And I think sometimes the tanky lefts, they'll apologize for the worst excesses of Russian and Chinese behavior. And it's like, look, I can't apologize anymore for the British Empire. And nor do I think we should use that to excuse.
But no one is asking you that, Chris. No one is asking you that. I think give an example of something China is doing right now. I'd love to discuss that because I'm not a pro-Chinese in here either.
Hong Kong. And then Taiwan's next. And we all know that's happening, right?
Sure, and just on the other side, like we're as well in a world situation where the American government officially is not part of the Paris Accord for climate change anymore, whereas China is making a large effort to become green energy. And so, like, we're in a strange situation right now, I think, global politically. But okay, let's go to Hong Kong and their territorialism.
Quickly on the green thing, because I think that's fairly easy to hash out. We all agree America and China should sign that, right? So I just think it's dangerous for America to go, but China, and China to go, but America, and nothing
China
to
wants
get
to
done,
sign.
Right?
I'm pretty sure China wants to sign everything.
China did sign it.
Yeah, everything I've read about the environment is that China is pushing the environment.
They did sign it on the condition that they would only have to be held to the reductions in 10 years' time, right?
No, most countries and places are counting on.
But
10, 20,
that's
30.
because America is the largest net producer of CO2. So fair enough.
But yeah, before we come to that, you guys know Boris Johnson used to write for the Telegraph like a weekly column. I'm not sure if he still does it.
No, not anymore.
There was a while ago where he wrote one column about Africa, where he basically made the argument that Britain should still be there because they planted the highest yielding crop in terms of profits. I was like,
human misery.
This guy's like I feel like people should read more his Telegraph articles. Have
you heard the IMF's version of that, where they make charter cities? So it's not colonialism; they just build cities in the desert, and they say these cities.
But Boris Johnson
separate from democracy.
Yeah, but Boris Johnson basically actively just defended the British Empire, which I was always impressed that this didn't make more traction in newspapers.
It's a popular position in Britain. It's a popular position in British newspapers.
Really? Wow.
Oh God, like it's very hard. So part of the reason why Jeremy Corbyn was so unpopular was because he was seen as anti-British. And to be anti-British is to say
history happened.
Yeah, it's like, those people that I'm not racist, but it's like, well, I don't hate Britain, but maybe the British Empire wasn't the best thing ever. Everyone's like, oh,
really?
Why don't you? Oh, yeah, very unpopular opinion.
Wow,
very unpopular opinion.
I mean, we don't talk about our colonial past much in the Netherlands. We like to keep it silent, but when it's mentioned, it's always mentioned as if we did a bad thing, and like we need to admit for it. Lately, we've been having discussions about our museum artifacts and returning our museum artifacts to our colonial.
We're not even close to reckoning with that. Although obviously younger people are. And I didn't realize it until I walked around the Royal and Albert and any British museum, and you're just like, oh my God, this is just a crime scene. This is just, and especially when you see religious artifacts raided from temples, you're like, oh, this is the sort of thing that when the Vikings did it to Christian churches, we were horrified by the barbarianism of it. So yeah, it's difficult to reckon with, and I think we're a long way away. Even so, Jeremy Paxman, who is the BBC pretty much for most people, I think less than 10 years ago, went to India and did a documentary how. But we did give you the trains, right? And trains are nice. So on balance, you probably owe us. Well, we're going to go off topic if I start talking about Winston Churchill. So let's bring it back into China.
To bring
please.
it back into China, I suppose, like when the Belt and Road Initiative was first announced, I was really, really optimistic, and I thought it was a brilliant idea. I was 100% behind it. I thought it was going to be brilliant. But what I've seen from China, particularly in the last 6 years or so, I've just seen China, like for instance, like I did a lot of modules about ethnic minorities in China, and I'm not going to put my hands up and say that China was ever very benevolent to their ethnic minorities. And there are 55 different minorities that are recognized. But things were definitely a lot better for people. And what I've seen, like for instance, now you look at what's happening with the Uyghurs, that's long going on. But there's also an ethnic minority in China called the Hui. And they're Muslims as well. They're all over China, but they're not persecuted against at all. Chinese people have no problem with the Hui, and that's because they're Han Chinese. So the question isn't about Islam. It's not about religion. It's just
Han
about
nationalism, right?
Yeah.
Will you tie the party line? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And
I do worry a bit about the argument, though, that things are getting better. This is similar to when the British say, but we abolished slavery. And you're like, yeah, after dominating it for centuries. And it's similar with the Chinese, like, but look, that brought people out of starvation. And you're like, who was in charge when that starvation was happening?
Yeah.
Sure, but on the reality in the country, you cannot deny the socio-economical evolution that they've experienced, right? Like that's a real thing for
Well, I don't know if
it's
it's not a real thing in Xinjiang for the Uyghurs. I mean, they talk about the autonomous region, the local government, but that's still nearly mostly Han Chinese. There's a few token Uyghurs put in there, but I mean, there was a time before, when I say it was better before, they used to have these point systems. So if you were an ethnic minority, you had more access to university. People used to be going to their lineage trying to find ethnic minority grandparents or so that they could get the points. But all those sort of perks are being taken away gradually, and it's becoming more Han dominated. As if it could be more. It's like 96% of the country is Han Chinese. But
sure, that's the ideology, I think, right? The country plus the territories that they lay claim to, Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the rest of the world doesn't necessarily, I think, need to be Han Chinese, as long as the Han Chinese dominate the rest of the world economically.
That's true.
Good strategy there.
That's the Chinese will always say about their history. You know, we never actually actively colonized anywhere. We sent boats around the whole of the world before the Portuguese and Spanish came to Asia. We didn't really see anything that interested us, you know. So that's what they say. So don't fear us. We're not going to do anything bad. But I kind of think the way you treat your own people should be an indication of how things would go if they were given the chance to treat you like that.
So there's a big spectrum, right? From absolute apologism, like, the Uyghurs are doing fine, like, they're doing brilliant, and all China's about is just everyone integrates, and why can't we be friends? To the hysteria that a Holocaust is happening under our eyes, and there's even then this fringe like conspiracy theory that the Chinese are selling Uyghur baby organs.
Organs. Right? Well, you have the religious group that they're organ harvesting.
Falun Gong.
Yeah. I mean, these are, I think, pretty sanctioned sources that we're hearing from China about this.
Sorry, so this is actually happening.
Well, it's hard to get organs in China. People don't tend to give up their organs that easily. It's tied in with
it's part of their burial rites, right?
I thought this was like proven happening, yeah.
So this is more like forcing donor cards on people rather than killing people for their kidneys.
I don't think it's happening open in the hospitals, but...
Well, it's like nobody really knows what happens to people who are executed. You know, China executes more prisoners than anywhere, I think. I think if you combine the whole world population of people who are executed, China kills more than
I mean, but the scale of China probably wins on most world records for numbers.
That's true. Right? That's true. But anyway, there is a theory that those people who are killed by the state, their organs are also harvested. But
so utilitarianism. Well, this gets to the crux of it, and Mereng said, like, is China evil? I think there's no doubt that Hong Kong was, and again, it was one of these, 500-year deals. The British signed it without thinking, oh yeah, we have to give it back to you when? Who cares? That's so far in the future. Chinese are like, brilliant, that's a short time, got it. And yeah, Hong Kong's now a huge valuable thing that China owns. They have started breaking all of the terms and conditions of that breakup, so Britain might grow a pair and actually start boycotting China and some things.
Oh, right. The same way we grew up. The same way we grew a pair when Russia invaded Ukraine, right?
Well, yeah, clearly not. And look, this is happening all over the world, though. The interesting thing is, for all America's free market religiousness, if you look at how China was about to build a 5G infrastructure in a few countries off the basis of Huawei, and America saw no and vetoed that deal in a sort of protectionist thing. So pieces on the board seem to be moving in an accelerating fashion.
But you were saying
don't think so,
sorry.
actually.
No?
I mean, if you look at the UK, I mean, the UK under David Cameron and George Osborne, you were best mates with China. It was going to be this phenomenal relationship. Xi Jinping was brought over to have a pint in the pub with Cameron. It was a big deal. So I was really surprised last year when this whole Hong Kong thing kicked off again, and Britain actually did something about it and said something, because up until that point, as co-guarantors of the agreement, you'd said nothing. And I think Brexit probably comes into that a little bit as well. There's more, you're going more towards the United States. But I mean, you look at somewhere like Germany. I think Germany is the biggest trade partner with China, and you never hear about it. But it was much fanfare in Britain at the time, big state visits.
Britain needs it.
Well, yeah, that's the other side of it. But I mean, like, from
Very
a Chinese
soon.
perspective at the time, it was brilliant, because after that, 100 years of humiliation that the British brought on after the Opium War, it was great to see the British, from a Chinese perspective, hovering there saying, oh, please give us, come build this nuclear power plant for us, buy up all our water. But there has been a definite policy change in the last year or so. It's very interesting.
Well, not just policy, like there's massive protests kicking off in Hong Kong, which seem to have been all but quashed. God, the news cycles are so quick now, but they just arrested a bunch of politicians, and then the entire opposition resigned in protest, right?
I mean, that's been going on for years, though, and Britain has only started to take interest last year, really, to the point where they would say anything officially.
And I think the real thing is, if we all had to put a bet on what's going to be happening in Taiwan in 20 years, it'll be Hong Kong 4.0, right?
Well, China always says, we have thousands of years of history. Whether it happens tomorrow or it happens in 100 years, it's going to happen.
They don't care. Yeah, they'll wait it out.
They have the long view.
Yeah. One nation, one country, just ethnic replacement. Yeah.
Sure.
And the whole thing of China coming back to the UN and like with all these trade agreements was, let's just agree to disagree on Taiwan. Let's just not talk about it. What we call Taiwan, what they call China.
That nowadays we have, like, with 5G, this big new thing that the US blocks a foreign provider. I mean, the US is always like, they are really the free trade nation, but really only unless it suits them. And they always find some random reason. And the exact same thing happened about 30, 40 years with Japan. So in the 80s, Japan became like the big threat in the East to the US industry. And I think Ronald Reagan at the time, he blocked, I believe it was Japanese semiconductors, so most of their high-tech industry, because American companies couldn't compete and were just massively outmatched by the Japanese products. So obviously the first minute was like, yeah, they're obviously cheating, so let's put some trade barriers in there. And even before that, whenever it doesn't suit them, I think it was also that the American steel corporations, they also struggled against Japan. And obviously the government was like, oh yeah, they must be cheating, so let's put up some barriers there to help them. And it's really a thing of the US just tries to protect their own industries as much as they can, while also just
stopping other countries
about free trade.
Yeah, stopping other countries from protecting their industries as much as they can. Yeah.
So is China doing that? Is China trying to stop other countries from? Logically, that they try to focus also internally, but are they stopping, like America does, other countries, right? it's not yet happening. I'm not yet seeing China
No, and
interventionism at the scale of Russia or America does.
No, and there's a pride in China of being like looking to America's mistakes and being like, let's not do that. Right, like this is like
That's smart.
M's point about soft power rather than their idea that how many trillions have the US wasted in the Middle East for oil, which won't be a valuable resource in 10 years' time? Like,
Well,
Yeah.
China doesn't need to open up any country for trade. They already are trading on like pretty low tariffs anyway.
Mhm.
And China has arguably the most efficient factories in the world.
Mhm.
I mean, like most of the US, all the high-tech stuff is already being built in China anyway.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's very difficult to replicate something. It takes a really long time, a lot of work to make all of this work.
China's
So-
protectionism has been so clever. If you look at when iPhone, it was actually Foxconn with the big factories, but yeah, when Apple came into China and all these companies, they said, yes, you can come and take advantage of our cheap labor force, but these are the terms and conditions, right? So they were sending all these engineers to universities in the West. And then when Apple came, they're like, right, you'll only get a visa to come if 3 engineers can follow you around and watch everything you guys do and learn everything from you. And
Yeah,
that's
and
how we make it. And that's
China-
the basis of Huawei, right? It's just copying.
I mean, there's a requirement that China has to own, I think, nearly half of any kind of foreign investment. So China owns a substantial part of any company being started in China. And I would support it generally. In terms of the speed of Chinese industrialization, it's just unparalleled. I mean, China doesn't do anything substantially new. They do the same thing South Korea and Taiwan did just 60 years ago, just on a much, much larger scale. But it's really nowadays we have the illusion that the other smaller East Asian countries, including Japan, developed out of like some free market thing or whatever. But all of these were incredibly protectionist. They had massive government influence in their own industries and just made long-term investments in their own industries and only started free trade once their own industries were on a world-class level. I think Japan is actually the best example there. Japan is the only country outside of Western Europe and North America that industrialized. And they're also the only country that wasn't invaded and forced into open and free trade with the West. And it's a very strange coincidence. And you can also make the argument that Egypt was in a similar condition in the 19th century compared to Japan. But then the British came to Egypt and just basically destroyed the country. But if Egypt hadn't been invaded, there's a pretty good argument you could make that they might have become a rich country in just Africa. Countries protect their own industries. Countries are going to do that no matter what. You can't prevent that. And I mean, it's not generally a bad thing. It's just what governments do. It's in their own self-interest, obviously.
Yeah, and if a bunch of people work in an industry, why wouldn't they vote for a government that wanted to protect that, right? This is the damaging thing with globalization. And I mean, it depends whether you take a nationalist or a global perspective. Is it, you know, in general terms, the GDP of the world has gone up massively. For most of us in Europe, it's gone down. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's probably too big a question for now.
Wait, what do you mean? GDP didn't, like, besides, like, if you ignore coronavirus, GDP didn't go down.
Well, in real terms, so here's the problem with GDP as a value. I didn't mean GDP because the GDP
I mean,
goes
relatively.
up. Relative wealth in each person's pocket, like the ability of people to buy houses on you know, the sort of metrics that the Financial Times won't quote. Our ability to buy a house versus our parents, right now.
Oh, right. But that happened, like, China didn't influence that.
No, but world globalization did, right? So you don't think that's just a case of the money moving
Don't
abroad?
think so.
But world globalization is not necessarily a bad thing either. It also allows someone in the village in Africa to produce something, to create a website, to ship it with an international shipping company, and compete with any other company and anywhere else in the world who's doing global shipping. Right?
Compete best if he sells it via Amazon, but yeah, sure.
It also gives access to a certain segment of the market that didn't have access, and there's political intervention in this as well. Yeah.
Like, you can do free trade agreements or free trade in general in so many different ways. the reason why globalization has been harmful to workers or just everybody in general was because the trade agreements that have been done are very beneficial to people that already have money. But
Sure,
that wasn't a given. Like, let's say if the US had a stronger, let's say, labor movement, for example, or a more left-wing Democratic Party or even Republican Party, they could have made very different trade agreements, and that wouldn't have led to like massive outsourcing of jobs.
This was Trump's promise, right? Like he said he would stop this, and stick up for the American workers. And
and I mean, even Bernie Sanders said that Trump did get a better trade deal. Like, it's very minor improvements, and it's still a terrible deal. But like, they could have been done better. And I think that's also what Elizabeth Warren said, that when she, or if she had become president, and her trade agreement, there wouldn't be like CEOs of corporations in the trade deal. There would have been human rights activists, environmental activists, economists, for example.
Yeah, I've been very impressed by Elizabeth Warren. Is there an argument that anytime any politician gets a good deal for workers, it will be panned in the press because the press represents capital?
But the way I hear it, this is all great, but this is all very much like the Western left wing wanting to have, caring about human rights. But what if you don't care about human rights? What if the only thing you care about is the socio-economical uplifting of your own class and letting your own class live according to a certain set of rules that you consider to be moral, which is kind of what they're implementing with the credit system, right? I could see evangelical Americans doing the exact same thing. Listen, here's the Bible. If we can implement a camera tracking system that follows exactly how you follow the Bible, otherwise you get negative credits, and fuck all the minorities. Kind of happened already in the United States.
Yeah, this is what I was going to say. We've hinted at this argument before. I don't think that the social credit system in China is that strange or revolutionary. I think, well, look at how many CCTV cameras are around us and how well connected GCHQ and CIA has access to that data. If you look at, if you were tweet the wrong thing, how quickly your front door would have a knock, right? Like, we all have credit ratings, might not be social, but you can tweet the wrong thing, you can owe the wrong person money. Like, it's not that different in our system, is it?
But the social thing matters, right? Sorry, Em.
I mean, it is at least somewhat different.
It's interesting because I'd say most of my Chinese friends are in favor of the social credit system because they feel that people are losing their morals and they're badly behaved, and it's a way to... like it's an interesting thing, in China, when you go to the bathroom, everyone has to bring their own toilet roll because they say if you had it there, people would steal it. So this is what they're trying to fight against. They actually brought
it's just logical.
They brought in these new things that scan your face and give you a few sheets at a time, so they know if you're taking too much. But that's what they're trying to rally against, bad behavior in society. And I think Xi Jinping he's of the opinion that materialism in Chinese society is corrupting society. So it's meant to be a sort of pushback on that. But I suppose it's a difficult thing to reconcile that if I went and bought 2 bottles of wine on a Friday night, the state would say, well, you know what, you're not getting a train to Beijing next week because we don't agree with what you did there. It's or you can't hang around with your brother anymore because he's a degenerate.
Exactly. But ask an average person that goes to church, maybe not now, but maybe a few years ago, or someone that is very religious in the States, and they will say the exact same thing.
Yeah, they will.
Right? Follow our moral rules. Everything you deviate from it is wrong. God will punish you. We'll stop you.
Community is being eroded by people not doing this, and they should be punished and ostracized.
Yeah. We come from the Western progressive freedom of expression, freedom of what you do with your body, etc., etc. But this is not necessarily the common agreement worldwide. Let's just say, because in China they're all pro this system. A lot of people.
Well, so that brings me on to that sort of the final point I want to get into is that. Is democracy and freedom overrated? I know it's a big topic, but there's a big argument that looking at India and China, everyone thought India would win because it had democracy. Like, if the main game of most countries seems to be economic growth, Is
Well,
democracy getting in the way?
yeah, it's a good argument. I suppose the Chinese perspective, they'll always say, you know, this is such a large country. We've always had one ruler. We've had an emperor because it's just too big to govern. Yeah, well, that's what they'll say.
Yeah.
We need one strong ruler to lead us all. But I think more recently, the argument against democracy has been stronger because I know after Brexit and Trump, you know, the Chinese were sort of saying like, look what the act of self-harm that you can do. And there's a level of pragmatism when it comes to China that I just don't think that people have faith in their leaders, I think, when it comes to these sort of things. So they would trust Xi Jinping to make the right decision on trade. But yeah, I couldn't see, like, the argument for democracy recently has just been eroded. Maybe it's going to come back a little bit now after this recent US election. Maybe we'll have some return to order, but
I'm going to strongly disagree with you, which will be
really
fun.
okay.
Yeah, don't be surprised.
In my rambles.
no, like brilliant points. I'm just very pro democracy, and I think
Yeah, you should be.
Oh, I am too.
This is what we're defending. No, but listen,
sure.
we are the beacon of humanism, democracy, freedom of expression.
And let me put these arguments forwards. I think that had democracy reigned, Bernie Sanders would have won the Democratic Party election and stood a better chance of Trump in 2016. I think had Brexit been listened to and Jeremy Corbyn been free to voice his anti-EU opinions, we would have Jeremy Corbyn as the current Prime Minister. Had he run on the pro-Brexit platform, which he honestly was, Jeremy Corbyn's one of the few politicians that's been anti-EU membership for the longest period of time. I think we would have ended up with that. I think instead what we got was a bunch of focus groups advising Jeremy Corbyn to shut the hell up, a bunch of Democratic DNC, right? In America, people saying, okay, well, maybe we should promote Trump as an option in 2016 because Hillary's most likely to beat him. And the clusterfuck that resembled. And at the end of the day, it was a bunch of people protest voting against how politics was no longer representing them or their interests, but big money once again. And the fact that the DNC went with Biden, who is, I mean, here's my challenge to you, find a more establishment politician than Biden. I think the argument that Trump's an evil Nazi dictator and Biden represents freedom is definitely one side's argument. And I can see it. I'm not completely disagreeing with it. I think some of the anti-democratic things Trump were doing was incredibly alarming. But at the same point, he promised anti-establishment, which is exactly what people wanted, because fuck the system, and he wasn't given that. So I don't think it's an example of democracy and freedom in action and people being listened to.
No, but democracy is also making mistakes. Democracy is also the British voting for Brexit by mistake, you know.
Yeah, no, and I think we should accept that and not have another referendum. Yes, like democracy's messy. I think people should be made to feel the pain of their shitty decisions. Yeah. Hopefully they vote better next time. The left's push to have another referendum and not honor that first one is really anti-democratic and really dangerous. And it's why the Conservatives won by such a massive majority in the last general election when they should have been fucking destroyed.
Isn't it great that you can change your mind though in a few years? And
yes, but that's only because it's taken a few years and Brexit still hasn't been done. Like if you voted for Biden and then Trump didn't leave office for 4 years because he was like, well, we're still recounting the votes, that isn't great. And that's not democratic.
Playing devil's advocate, another bonus to having a non-democratic system is, you know, you've got continuity. You can plan in 20, 30 years and you know that plan is going to still be there. You don't have to worry about a new party coming in and steamrolling over everything, which is another reason why China's been so successful.
And it's why more and more countries look up to China because they see that as progress, and what's happening in America as chaos.
I mean, let's not take America as the only example of how democracy can work, right? If you look at the Scandinavian, the Nordic countries, they
But
do
they're
split
small
governments,
countries
but they
now.
keep policies going. They don't fight as much. They
But
cooperate more.
But look
India
at-
is the closest comparison. And is
Yeah.
India well run? Is it?
Well,
I mean, the thing is-
who could run India well though, other than the British?
yes, Boris Johnson. Be the
I would
greatest.
also say look
Let's-
to
let's
Germany,
give them
like
Boris Johnson.
strong woman politics, right? Like
Well,
so-
that's another thing. You know, only 26% of CCP members are women. There's very few women involved in Chinese politics. And Mao himself said, you know, women hold up half the sky. Well, that's not very evident in China. So.
It's a fair point. Anyway, Christian, I have soft pitched you the perfect argument for why democracy makes the world a better place.
All the arguments are set against democracy. You could also have said, let's say, 40 years ago about the Soviet Union. And what ultimately brought down the Soviet Union was an increasing concentration of power in like one tiny Politburo and like a tiny committee that made all decisions. And literally every guy in there was this 70-year-old fossil destroyed by a lifetime of alcohol overconsumption. And because those guys just planned the economy so bad because they had so much power and were just incompetent at it.
So little feedback, so little need to change anything. Yeah.
And the problem is that Russia wasn't brought down by like communism or whatever that even means. They are brought down by a lack of democracy. And we can see the same thing right now in the US, I feel. That you have more and more companies having more and more power. And as a consequence, they have fewer and fewer people in charge that have a greater and greater sway over like a larger amount of people. And this is kind of the same that happened to the Soviet Union. So I think in China right now, there's no call for democracy because the system is at least somewhat working. Not for everybody. And I think there are quite a few protests in China just locally, except they're not being promoted, but they do happen. I feel like I've read about this a while ago, but there are a few hundred, if not thousands, protests every day, but they're very local and very small. And obviously very much opposed by the state as well. Mm-hmm. But I would say wait a couple of, well, possibly decades. But if China encounters its first actual major depression, where the government cannot spend just more money.
Every system can survive the good times, right? Every system looks good during economic
I mean, this is why
growth.
Trump, until coronavirus, was doing really well in the polls and would have won. Because nothing really happened the last 4 years. There was like no major problem or anything. They could get by not doing anything. And so, yeah, that's the same thing for China, that they are slowly becoming less and less, or let's say more and more concentrated in terms of economic and political power. And eventually that is going to crash.
Right, eventually.
We just have to see when.
Eventually, you're saying, because look at this year, and what country, amongst others, made it the best through Corona? China. They're all partying out in China right now. We're sitting at home. They're partying out.
I mean, yeah, but you can't really sneak out and go meet your mate in China. They'll know really quickly if you're breaking restrictions.
This is it though, right? Authoritarianism always works better in a crisis than like when we were talking to the Americans who are like, I won't be mandated anything. And you're like, right, so you're not built to survive
well, listen,
a massive crisis.
Authoritarianism might work very well for the Han Chinese for the next couple hundreds of years.
I think I agree with Christian to a point. I think, you know, so much of Xi Jinping's return to Confucian values, a lot of that centers around, you know, the mandate of heaven that the emperor has. But he only retains the mandate of heaven so long as his people are, you know, content and he's leading by example, etc., etc. But I think people are willing to give up freedom and democracy if, you know, they're healthy, they're wealthy. And when those two things are taken away, then you're going to get the uprising, because people aren't going to put up with those sort of restrictions if they don't have those things. And that's one of the reasons why there is so much emphasis on green energy and, you know, getting rid of pollution, because if children are getting cancer from the air pollution, people aren't going to put up with the party system. And it's a similar thing with the economy.
But that's a good system, right? If you keep your people healthy and happy.
Yeah. And I'll say similar, like if you look at the rise of Boris Johnson, it's similar dogma and rhetoric, right? It's appealing to the old British Empire values. It's, you know, that rah-rah tribalism. And it works for one election, and then people go, oh, crisis came and you fucked it up so hard. Like, don't really feel like singing the national anthem behind Boris Johnson right now, because yeah, he, at the end of the day, like his actions and his results don't match his rhetoric. So it works for a couple of years, but the wheels fall off. Likewise with China, like so far, growth. So you can hang people on nationalism, falling in line, and people will, as you say, as long as that's in their best interest.
And I mean, they're getting to the point now, you know, the burgeoning middle class, there's going to be that point where it's not going to be that cheap to manufacture in China because the wages are increasing. So they're going to have to find a new way of doing things, less copying, more innovating, you know, becoming more high market, creating more high market things. And, you know, like that's all very important for moving forward. And again, that's why the Belt and Road Initiative is so key, because it's part of extending that growth. But eventually, you know, like Christian says, there will come a point where what happens then?
Well, eventually can take a while. Can take more generations than exist.
And this is why they have a 100-year plan, and most of our politicians only have a plan for re-election, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Sure. What do you say about, sorry, go for it, mate.
I could say the same about the fall of the American civilization, or how we want to call it. Might happen in 4 years, might happen in 100 years. It's impossible to predict these things.
Hasn't it
Might
already
have happened at
happened?
all? Who knows?
It is called the American experiment, right?
Hasn't it already happened?
Oh no.
What do you say to the
dangerously close,
the American propaganda which says that the problem with China and everything you just described, they can't copy anymore, they have to innovate. And so the American capitalist dream would be that these countries aren't capable of innovating because being creative comes from questioning authority, questioning the establishment, questioning the ways it's been done. And if you have a whole economy based on just copying the best ideas, they're very poorly positioned to...
I think Nintendo is pretty revolutionary, the stuff that they come out with. Yeah. And that's a very establishment country where people follow the rules.
I mean,
Japan, South Korea.
Yeah, but the Japanese are just weird, right?
No. So they made the exact same argument about Germany in the 1950s. And you know, the label made in Germany nowadays is like a sign of high quality. Back then it was considered a warning that this is a counterfeit product made by like former Nazis, basically. That's the origin of that label. And that's what Germany did. Germany just copied superior products from the UK and from the US. And then after a long period of time, they eventually started to make their own products. But for quite a long time, it was all just, let's copy better products. And then we learn the process. And nowadays, nobody would say that Germany is just like a copying country. And they're going to say the same about China in like 20 years. They're like, oh yeah, there's like the industrial center that outsources jobs to India because it's cheaper there.
Yeah. Or in Russia.
But yeah, I mean, China's already innovating. Like they are leading in 5G very easily. They're also leading in solar power, for example.
But
like they are the major innovators in solar power.
Don't they even have like the top 3 universities in the world? I guess according to rankings.
What metric?
They're not very high in like the top 100.
I mean, university rankings are bullshit anyway, so who cares? I mean, China has an incredible amount of know-how, and they can just create competitive products globally.
Yeah, on the university point, it's interesting that, China gives away so many scholarships as well to international students. It's a huge amount. I think there's something like 300,000 foreign students at Chinese universities. So that's sort of like what the likes of Stanford and Yale used to do. They used to educate Chinese kids, but now it's the reverse.
Yeah. And it's amazing watching the playbook. I think China's doing phenomenally well at seeing what other countries did well and what we discuss as the embarrassment of the West and the things they fuck up. China does seem to learn from. And look, being slightly optimistic here, I don't see China building military bases around Europe, around America. I do see them doing it around small countries in the Asian Pacific, and that sucks for them, like Taiwan, Nepal, sorry, like I don't think the West is going to stick up for you, but I don't think it's going to end up in World War III, right?
But I mean, something like soft power, like it's usually small states like Norway and Ireland and stuff who focus on soft power because we don't have any hard power really. So why is China so focused on soft power? And someone like Mearsheimer will say like, oh, you know, states are they're always looking to expand. They're looking for hard power. And is it just a case of China will do that once they get to that point? They're nowhere near it now, but they are putting a lot of money into military. And is it defensive?
I think so, because if you look at America and Russia jockeying for position in Syria, how long's that been going on? When is the end in sight? Like, never. And at this point, it will just be, you know who wins? The Chinese companies making drones, selling to both sides. Like, for everything I've heard from leaders in Chinese government, foreign policy, business, it just looks at the trillions that America loses yearly. I was describing this to my wife today. I can't believe the Iraq war is still going on. Still. Even though it's generally accepted that it was founded on bullshit reasons. Yeah, China just looks at that as an embarrassment, just as a failure. Like, and I don't see them gearing up for World War III. As you said, Christian, it would be a short war with all the nukes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the thing is that China would never start a war with the US because I think the US has about something like 40 times as many nuclear weapons.
And also, like, this is the joy of economics, as evil as it is. China doesn't want to fight US. They want to sell them tat, right?
I think a more likely would be a war with India. That's the one I would be watching.
Yeah, that could be much more likely.
Yeah. They had a war not too long ago, really, and it's been kicking off again. They're on the borderlines recently. I think there was a few soldiers killed a month ago or so.
But yeah, I think right now China's objective is to isolate India in terms of trade and in terms of political alliances. I mean, this is what you see right now.
India's been isolating itself in many ways, right?
Yeah, but China's doing really well in forming alliances, kind of what Europe did in the, let's say, 19th century and early 20th century, where countries form more and more complex agreements while trying to isolate. So France trying to isolate Germany, Germany trying to isolate France. And I think this is what you can see right now with China and India. That China is trying to isolate India because that's their only real competitor on the continent. Maybe bar Japan, and then the US is obviously a completely different thing. Their soft power, I feel, is pretty natural extension that they can't really compete with the US militarily. They just couldn't manufacture all those nuclear weapons. It's just unfeasible. And they have a booming economy that is looking to invest abroad. So why not use that and actually invest abroad and then get resources along the way? It works pretty well together.
Yeah, and that is the more likely outcome. Interestingly, with the Democrats who've recently been elected, historically, they've had a much more trade-focused agenda. And I think we can all see it probably going that way. The Democrats will probably be gunning for Russia, if not directly, then in the proxy wars in the Middle East. But I imagine them both engaging more with China and trying to cut trade deals with the countries around. Is anyone optimistic about that, or will it be just aggressive saber rattling?
I don't know. I'm less optimistic about China for the future, just because there was this whole vision of globalization and cooperation, and they were filling that void in the absence of a more kind of multilateral leader in the US. But I just think the level of nationalism, the Wu Mao men, where they're paid to put nice things about China on arguments, all that sort of stuff that's happening, it just seems a little bit more aggressive.
You see this happening in America as well, like for political reasons, you whip up nationalism, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
But then it ends up ruling you. You do it to help establish power, but then it's like a runaway train. And it's similar to what's happening with the Republican Party, having to shift righter and righter into weirder and weirder spaces, right? I worry that people whip up nationalism for their own ends and then find out that it's very hard to turn off that tap once it starts.
Yeah, I don't think the world's going in the right place. I think Europe and European humanism should be the dominant leading factor in the world.
New age of colonialism.
But no, not necessarily through colonialism, which, we should have learned from, right? Stumbled a bit, should have learned from, pick ourselves up and grow better person, which, I think we did. A lot of countries in Europe, they did. They grew from their past and they tried to make up for some of their mistakes. On the other hand, I don't think the future is going to be that well, because we're still in the USSR Cold War. We can't do shit about the USSR taking, or Russia taking, Crimea back. China is, as you said, well said, is playing both sides, selling to the Russians, selling to the Americans, and staying out of it. And meanwhile, America, which was European ally, is a mess as well. So, no.
Would anyone like to end us on a more positive note?
Oh, I got kind of one. I think like any kind of conflict that the US and China are going to have over the next, let's say, 20, 30 years are going to be overshadowed by climate change quite drastically. Who knows what's going to happen? But I think China is going to be much more affected than the US, for example, or even Europe.
Can you deepen that out? What is China's response to the global environment crisis going to be?
Well, China's big problem is that a lot of the population lives right on the eastern coast.
Yeah.
That's, I think, I don't know, like half the entire country lives just in like this tiny strip that is like, let's say, 40 kilometers from the coast.
Sure. So
and all of this...
Well, no,
all of this
as we've said as well, the Chinese are very good at fucking building, right?
Yeah, but all of this is very low-lying land with lots of river deltas. And now if you have a couple of meters of sea level rise, which are at this point basically inevitable, there's going to be a crazy amount of people and a crazy amount of property just being lost.
Right.
And that is going to be a massive problem for China.
Right.
And for the US, the likely outcome for the US is that Florida is just gone, like almost entirely. New Orleans and like the southern side of like Alabama, Mississippi are gone, and New York might be in trouble.
Right.
So it's a substantial amount of people, but much less compared to China.
But the result of this, right, is that people are going to migrate. You're going to get big migration flows, and that's going to bring the next level of what's going to happen due to the global climate crisis.
Real estate wealth is going to be lost. Good. And China's going to be ready with their construction workers, right? Like when those dams need building, like America can't even repair its own highways right now. So I think China's going to continue, building the dams like the Dutch once did, like, and that will be the necessary crisis that causes more cooperation.
Or not, who knows?
Great experiment.
Anything positive to end us on? Or negative, either one, I'll allow it.
There's nearly a coronavirus vaccine. That's something to look forward to.
Yeah, I was in preparation for this episode, I heard Corona described as China's Chernobyl, right? Like
dear.
Their massive crisis that America said they should have been more upfront and honest about. I love that argument though, because it's like, okay, so once you heard about Corona, what did you do with that information? Oh, nothing. Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
I think I have a good one. That now that China is becoming richer, they start to have a more developed anime industry. And they make some hilarious stuff. The one thing I've seen is that they have put Karl Marx as this 19th century nobleman. That's like romantic stories and like all in anime. It's amazing.
What? Send the link.
So probably like 20 years, China is going to have like the same kind of anime outputs that Japan has right now.
Oh,
I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's not even like maybe, it's definitely, because they're putting so much money, like the Chinese ministries, into into, like, they're so jealous of the K-pop thing. You see the amount of money that BTS is making for Korea and tourism. China's like, why can't we have that? We have so many people.
Is that your optimistic hand at the end of the episode, that we will soon have C-pop? Something to look forward to.
China will dominate the YouTubes very
Dominate
soon.
the airways, man.
Yeah.
Well, they blocked YouTube. That's the only reason why they don't have it.
Too much
Once it
K-pop.
goes open, it's just going to be China Tube.
Guys, thank you so much. I'd please ask you to any information, any readings, any YouTube channels, we'll put in the show notes below, because I think it's obviously a very deep topic that was always going to be a struggle to discuss in 2 hours. I've got a little quote here, but if anyone else has a quote, I'd welcome that too. This is from Confucius. The master said, "He who exercises government by means of his virtue may be compared to the North Polar Star, which keeps its place and all stars turn towards it."
Okay.
Anyone beat Confucius? No one can, and that's why we humbly submit to our Chinese overlords.